Hey there and welcome back to another Percy Jackson video. And man, it really has been a while since I last touched this fandom, eh? And with the recent talk about how we're getting closer and closer to a confirmed cast for the upcoming Disney Plus adaptation of the Percy Jackson and the Olympians book series, I've been steadily getting more and more hyped that this dream is finally going to turn into a reality. So I figured now would be as good a time as any to take a look at some of the fan discourse that surrounded this particular process, and the prevalent opinions on a number of different platforms. And I think it's clear that what I mean by this is whether the casting should take into account book descriptions and hold them as gospel when entering the casting process, or should they simply cast whoever they believe best encompasses the character, not just as a physical representation of a character's appearance, but whether they can accurately embody their personality and spirit. I mean, most fans can probably remember the uproar and the utter sense of dissatisfaction when Alexandra Daddario was cast as Annabeth, but her hair was not dyed or made to remotely look blonde. And yet, contrastingly, people consider Logan Lerman as perfect casting in terms of looks, but completely wrong timing, which honestly couldn't really have been helped in his case. And as for Grover, despite artists consistently drawing him as white, I don't think anyone actually had a problem with him being cast as black. And a lot of newer fans just started seeing him that way, because the movies were their first introduction to the character, and he isn't really pushed by the narrative, at least in my memory, as anything otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that these were the only opinions out there. I mean, I'm sure that some people did not care that Annabeth wasn't blonde, and some people might have thought that Logan Lerman looked nothing like Percy. And I guarantee that there were people that did have a problem with Grover being black. But from my standpoint, the majority seemed to sway these original ways. And despite the huge amount of criticism leveled at Fox after the initial adaptation, particularly about how Annabeth didn't have blonde hair, amongst other more pressing issues as well, but that one was a big one, the studio then decided to put a blonde wig on her and hope for the best. And as most fans know, the second film is by far the worst. We thought we had it bad with the first one, but then we had no idea how much farther it could fall. And this just kind of proves the point. You could tell they actually tried to make it more book accurate, with the hair, the setting, the looks. It felt closer to the world, but it couldn't save how terrible an adaptation it was. So in essence, whilst the casting in terms of looks is important, that won't save you from a terrible adaptation. You can have a cast that looks nothing like the characters, but they tell the story really well, and it can be great. Or you can have the characters picture perfect, and yet they manage to completely shit all over the story. And I mean, in my mind, physical accuracy and a good adaptation, they're just not mutually exclusive. And in all honesty, I think I can understand both perspectives of why or why not this matters to people. On one hand, you have the purists. Those people who want to strictly keep it to what's described in the books. Annabeth's blonde? Then blonde she must remain. Percy has black hair and green eyes? How dare you consider casting anybody that doesn't fit that description? The character's white. The character's black. This character needs to have red hair, etc., etc. You get where I'm going with this. They want to preserve these little details to ensure that what plays out on screen is as close to what their imaginations dreamed up when they read the books. And when that doesn't play out the way they want, it can often be really disappointing. And I think for a lot of people, it almost invalidates their own beliefs about certain characters and their portrayals in the story. And then there's also another aspect to these sort of opinions, that sometimes a character's storyline actually depends on them appearing a certain way. Their whole backstory and identity is partially shaped by the circumstances that they've lived in, and a lot of these circumstances are in turn shaped by aspects of their appearance, such as the colour of their skin. For instance, Peter Parker could be black. He could be white. He could be Asian. It doesn't matter. Whilst, yeah, the general choice is a white guy with brown hair, changing that part of his character doesn't have to change the character himself. It isn't something that usually factors into his background, and thus you can interchange it without too much of a shift in the narrative. Another example of this is the decision to cast more black actors in the upcoming Game of Thrones spin-off, House of the Dragon, as characters who in the original story are presented as white. Does this change affect the character? Maybe a little, but likely not enough to shift the overall narrative and the character's role in the story. They could go a whole lot more diverse for the casting, and not much would change from a narrative perspective. But then in contrast, there are a lot of examples of this actually mattering as well. I mean, can you imagine a white Black Panther? It completely changes the character in the story. And you wouldn't cast a person of colour as Adolf Hitler in your World War II biopic unless it was some sort of weird satirical parody. And this sort of thinking is very prevalent in the sequel series to Percy Jackson, The Heroes of Olympus, where you have characters like Leo, Frank, Piper, and Hazel, all with different ethnicities and skin colours that are often key parts of their character's identity and growth within the series. So in certain instances like these, where their appearance is something that's core to their characterization, changing it completely changes everything about how their character should behave and interact with the world in which they exist. So I do think there are some legit reasons why people might think that book descriptions should be followed to the absolute letter. But then I can also see the other perspective on this issue. I can see why people may think that it really doesn't matter. That having diversity in casting is a very good thing that opens up more opportunities for more people and allows wider demographics to actually connect with the show as they gravitate towards certain different characters. And then on top of that, it's understandable that the creators don't necessarily want to get too locked in to certain looks for different characters. I mean, imagine how annoying it would be if there was a child actor who was head and shoulders above the rest in terms of talent and skill. You want that kid to be Percy. They perfectly encapsulate the role of this character, and they make all the others look like trash in comparison. You believe this kid's Percy, but then you're told, oh no, they need green eyes, or this hair, or the book actually says they're white, etc, etc. And in the end, it stifles your pursuit to make the adaptation as good as it can be, because you're locked into a narrow creative vision. So this really brings me to the topic at hand. Should Percy Jackson go the route of purist casting, or simply casting who feels the best for the role based solely on their acting abilities? Because this has really become quite a hot button issue in the fandom, with significant back and forth as to how faithful the casting should be, comparing back to the previous adaptation where this wasn't followed, and how fans deserved a truly faithful adaptation to the series this time. And hell, even Becky Riordan waded in, and basically outwardly stated that they would likely be far more open in their casting process. And obviously, as with any such statement, that news was a little bit controversial. Nothing too intense, but there was a bit of anger that certain characters may be changed from how they were described in the novels, of particular focus being the character of Annabeth, and how she doesn't necessarily need to be blonde. And I gotta say, for the most part, I actually agree with this approach, because I'm of the opinion that if it doesn't directly matter to a character's background or storyline, then it really shouldn't be too much of a consideration for casting. Do I care if Percy's Latin American, or black, or white? At the end of the day, honestly, no, because of a few reasons. One, no one they ever cast is going to look absolutely how I imagine him to look. It never happens that way. Of course, they can cast people and you can see how they look similar to what you thought, but there's always like a 99% chance that they either won't live up to what you imagined, because let's be real, nothing's more realistic than your own imagination, and then you'll just have to reconcile with that anyway. And two, it doesn't really impact his character or background arc whatsoever. Sure, we get told what he looks like a lot, but the only thing that's remotely relevant is that he looks kind of like his dad. His black hair or his green eyes have no bearing on his actions or his character growth at all. But then this is a completely different situation to later books where there are characters who do have that heritage or that upbringing or key feature that really does matter to the portrayal. But for the most part, I don't think it really matters for this early in the process. A kid can look exactly like Percy, or at least what you imagined him to look like, but then he could be the worst actor imaginable. And then all you have is this steaming turd of an adaptation, round 2, to be memed on the internet forever. You'd ruin that poor kid's life, and what are we left with? Nothing remotely good to enjoy, except some dank memes. Or you can get a kid that has Percy's dry humour and wit and charisma and attitude down pat, but he doesn't have the green eyes, or look exactly how you'd expect him to. And I think I know which one I'd prefer. I think just going with the best kids who can pull it off seems like the best course of action. That being said though, there is one example I can think of where a character's appearance, at least in the original series, does seem to matter far more than usual in this early stage. Annabeth. Because I feel like being blonde is an actual character trait for her, right? Maybe I'm misremembering, after all it's been a while since I read the books, But is she not meant to be the super genius daughter of Athena? The planner? The strategist? The tryhard? A character who's super intense and borderline aggressive with her knowledge and expertise because she's self-conscious. And she's self-conscious that despite being the daughter of the goddess of wisdom, she feels like she resembles the archetypal dumb blonde and worries that people won't be willing to take her seriously. And so she overcompensates. And so, whilst I don't think it would be the end of the world if she wasn't how she's described, I think it does take a little bit away from her character if that makes sense. It's a part of her growth and her insecurities, and you'd want that addressed. Although on the other hand, I'm not sure how much this issue actually hits home in today's age. But being set in the 2000s, I remember dumb blondes being a thing. That was a stereotype. And if you want it to remain faithful to that setting and vibe, going with the stereotypical blonde issue would be a good foot forward. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. It is still the early days. So yeah, ultimately, I just think following your gut with who you think's the best choice for the role is the best way to cast a character. Especially chemistry between Percy, Annabeth and Grover. These kids are basically going to grow up on screen together. And you want them to have that strong connection and to click in the right way if you want their relationships to translate on screen. Physical attributes really don't matter as much as matching the heart of the character. Sure, it would be nice if we got people to look how we imagined, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be people that find flaws, even if you think they're perfect. There will never be a casting that every single person believes is the right choice. So if they don't have the book accurate eyes or hair or skin color, does it really matter? Bringing their personality to life on screen is far more important. And ultimately, staying faithful to physical descriptions only really matters when there's a genuine plot-driven or expositional reason as to why that should be the case. But, as always, those are just my opinions. And now I'd like to hear yours. How do you think Disney should approach casting with this adaptation? A more faithful style? Or picking and choosing what they think is best? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.